question.
Yeah, sure.
What do you think is global English?
To be honest, it doesn't really ring any bell, but I guess I don't know. I would say I don't know, English as in the language, or like global as in it's the first spoken language in the world. I guess. I don't know anything else. Doesn't ring any bell.
Hello guys!
Hi.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
What is global English to you guys?
Global English.
Yes.
I guess global English means that English is like a language spoken all over the world, so you can communicate to all people, different cultures, I guess.
I always feel like it kind of gives me the freedom to talk to everyone all over the world.
And I think English is probably the only language that works for,
Yeah.
because there's no other language that everyone can at least partly speak.
I think so as well.
As you guys can see in our interviews, not a lot of people actually understand what global English stands for. Nevertheless, they all agreed on that it's an international language and used globally. Even linguistics have a hard time putting a finger on what global English actually is. Some argue that it's not a thing. Others argue that it's not one thing, it's more of a plural thing. It's like global English is. One of the most famous authorities when it comes to linguistics, David Crystal, says that a global language is a language that achieves global status when it develops a special role that is recognized in every country, which English has successfully fulfilled. English is used globally around the whole world, and you can even find three kinds of English speakers. You have the native English speakers, you have the second language speakers, and you even have foreign English speakers. So in other sense, English gives the impression of being a global language. Would you say the same, Olivia?
Yeah, so as Nick just said, English is now considered as by far, as one of the pillars of spoken language. It is known as a lingua franca, as is spoken by more than 2 billion people around the world, in which 400 million people native speakers. So English became, with time, the common language in many fields like commerce, science, international diplomacy like UN, and culture, as 2/3 of the published books are in English and 80% of academic journals are also published in English. So to understand how English became what it is today, let's go back in time. In the 16th century, British people migrated to other countries like North America, which is today USA, Australia or New Zealand. Like English culture, the English language spread at a point where by the end of the 18th century, British colonies were located in places like India, Africa, Caribbean Isles, Canada and the US. This led to the development of different varieties of English called New Englishes, like Indian English. So during the 20th century, the American superpower also rose the position of the English language as it has become a world economic and political leader. Later, then also during the Industrial Revolution between the 50s and 60s. Today, the globalization pushed English to a standard language position, especially in business, aviation, or science. It has become the common language taught to children at school as a second language. Also, the emergence of pop culture played an important role, especially in movies with Hollywood, books, or music.
As fascinating as global English, or better global English is, and their reasons are, there are some issues surrounding this concept. One of the main issues with global English is the question of ownership. Who owns English? The inner circle, the outer circle, the external one? Let us first define what each of these circles represent. The inner circle encompasses all native speakers. Americans, British, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders. The outer covers mostly Eastern countries and a few former colonies of the empire, like Malaysia, Singapore or India, where English is spoken and used as an official second language. The external circle unifies all English as foreign language speakers who use and acquire English as a lingua franca to communicate outside of their countries for economic, academic and various other reasons. Now, which of these circles have the better claim to the language? It would make sense to say that the native English speakers own English. They were the first to use it and shape it. However, they weren't the last. As more countries picked English up as a convenient tool of communication, English took various shapes. It keeps changing to this day and acquires more speakers by the minute. English is a bit like the fire Prometheus stole from the gods. The native speakers may have used it first and nourished it, but once it became accessible to all the second and foreign language learners, it wasn't just their English alone anymore. All these new speakers enhanced the language by making it their own, adding their flavors and knowledge. Spreading like a wildfire, there are now so many different types of Englishes. The question here is, how English are these types of Englishes? Are some more English as others, or less? How do you even define prototypical Englishness? As it stands, there's no real standard, no real global English as such, because every speaker has their very own kind of English. Whether that's a good or bad thing is open for debate. Should there be a standard global English though? If yes, who decides which is the right one? All of this illustrates the ambiguity of the topic at hand. Finding a consensus might be an impossible feat, particularly since English itself is already, as David Crystal calls it, a romance of a language, an amalgamate of various languages as can be seen in the range of loanwords that keep expanding its lexicon. If anything, the creators of the proto-language could be considered the first owners of the unrefined English language. But alas, they're long gone, so why consider them the owners? Nobody really owns a language once there's more than one speaker, or once it goes global. Another issue global Englishes bring with them are of regional and cultural nature. This affects native speakers as much as second or foreign language learners, since their English is enhanced and influenced by certain loanwords, idioms and other localisms determined by their backgrounds. Sometimes people even use different words to convey the same message. For example, the British English variety uses the word crisps for what is generally known as chips in the rest of the world. Scottish speakers borrow bits from Scots and Gaelic, like the word wee for small. In a global context with speakers from different backgrounds, understanding each other might remain difficult, despite using a form of global English to communicate. Now, knowing all of this, what does the future look like?
So linguistic history has shown us that we need to be cautious. We can't make predictions about what is going to happen with a language. If in the Middle Ages we had suggested that Latin would be no more the language of education, people had laughed in your face. And they have done the same if in the 18th century you had assured that any language other than French could be a new norm of a polite society. As David Crystal says once, a week could be a long time in politics, but a century is a short time in linguistics. And a lot of people think today that English is going to have an assured future, but we need to take into account some issues that could impede the growth of English as a global language. So the first issue is the rejection of English. It could happen that the population of a country feel antagonistic about English and they reject English to be in a privileged status either as an official language or as a foreign language. If several countries start to think in this way, the global status of English would begin to be less credible. Another important issue to take into account is the US situation. As we know, The future status of English has a lot to do with the future of that country, because so much of the power that English achieved during the 19th century comes from America, and it is known that this country contains like 4 times as many mother tongue speakers than any other nation. It is in control of the new industrial revolution, so that it has everything to do with the way English is developing worldwide. And the last issue that we need to take into account are the new Englishes. The British writer Salman Rushdie commented that the English language ceased to be the sole possession of the English some time ago. That means that no one can now claim the ownership of English, which is probably the best way of defining a global language. In fact, the loss of ownership is uncomfortable to those who feel that the language is theirs by historical right.
So after watching us talking about global English and what it actually is, what do you guys think? Is English a global language?
And if so, do you think its global future is assured?